G'day IB Psychologist. In this video, I'm going to explain how you can cover human relationships, the option for paper 2 in IB Psychology, in 8 studies. So I'm just going to start by saying these studies come from our unit on love and marriage. So you might have been using different studies if you were doing the human relationships option. So some of the tips and advice might still apply. If you think really carefully about which studies to use, you'll be able to see how to address the questions. But these studies all come from our resources. A reminder, so in paper 2 in the options, standard level, you'll have 1 option, 1 hour, 1 essay. High level, 2 options, 2 hours, 2 essays. In a previous video, I explained how you could do abnormal psychology in 7 studies. So if you're a high level student, you can do all of paper 2 in 15 studies. This is of course for a regular exam year. This year, I'm making this May 2021, standard level you don't have paper 2 because of the coronavirus changes. High level students, you only have 1 option. So you could do abnormal psychology with 7 studies, human relationships with 8. But the goal here, remember, is not to see how few studies you can use. All right, I'm going to explain later what's even more important than the studies to get top marks. So if we look at the human relationships topic, we first of all, before we know what studies to use, we have to figure out what are the questions going to be. So there are 3 questions for every option in the exam. And because there are 3 topics per option, there's going to be 1 question per topic. And it states this exactly in the guide. So that means you're guaranteed 1 question at least from the personal relationships, either the topic or the sub-content points here. There'll be 1 from group dynamics, 1 from social responsibility. That means choose 1. Just choose 1 of these topics and the relevant sub-content to be an expert at. Now, which topic do you choose? Well, when you start looking at the fact that the question could be about the topic heading or the content headings, then you have to consider the research methods, the ethical considerations, the biological, cognitive, and social cultural approaches. For me, the best one is personal relationships. When we look at all of these factors combined, I think this is the best, especially relating biological, cognitive, and social cultural factors. When you have to prepare all of these things, this I think makes the most sense. Sure, these other ones could be prepared, but it's a little bit trickier. I really like the personal relationships for this. So that's where we're going to look at here. Now, the personal relationships, we're going to look at 3 prime examples of it, right? So in the formation of personal relationships, the example we're looking at is mate preference, right? So I like to explain this as why do we fall in love, right? Doesn't she look like she's in love there? Marital satisfaction is the role of communication. It can either increase or decrease marital satisfaction. That's what communication in relationships does. And divorce, that's the explanation for why relationships change or end. The example we're looking at here is divorce. Why do people fall out of love and get divorced? Now the reason for that is communication. So there already we can see how we can use the same studies and the same arguments for different topics. So just at a glance, here are the 8 studies that we're looking at. Gottman and Levinson, just remember, so there are 2 studies that we're going to look at here. So how can we use all these 8 studies to cover any possible question on personal relationships? Well, first of all, we've got the formation. Like I said, that we're looking at the psychologists call this mate preference, or attraction is another word you might use. Communication and its link with marital satisfaction. The examples here are the 5-1 rule and the 4 horsemen as devised by Gottman. Sorry, formation we're going to explain using evolutionary explanations and cultural explanations. And the explanations for the end, we're going to use communication, but also introduce this idea of attributions. This has been added because of the need to link to a specific cognitive process in relationships. So Johnston is a study on facial features and characteristics and looking at the types of features that females typically find attractive and the evolutionary explanation for that. Now, I'm not going to go into details of all these studies. That would be a much longer video, but I just want to show you, how you could use these studies for these different topics and which studies you could use. Buss's cross-cultural study, again, looking at evolutionary explanations of mate preference. Also, it has a cultural element there as well. And Levine's study is a cultural study looking at the relative importance of love in whom we choose to form a relationship with. Gottman and Levinson, so John Gottman is the key communications researcher in psychology. And so we're looking at communication. He came up with his 5-1 rule and the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse: contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism. right? So we can use his studies for both of those studies we can use for this topic. Raymond Holtz Monroe, so the idea here, Gottman and Levinson, that research comes out of America. I mean, would it apply across cultures? And that's what Raymond Holtz Monroe tried to look at in comparing Pakistani couples with American couples. So again, that gives us an explanation for communication and satisfaction, marital satisfaction. Again, anything here that we use for communication, we can use for explanations for why relationships might end as well. But then we introduce these studies, Finchen and Graham and Connolly, particularly about attributions. And attribution is how you explain behavior. Are you making a dispositional attribution or a situational attribution? Are you explaining someone's behavior because of their internal characteristics or their external characteristics? And what they find is that happy couples, if your partner does something good, they tend to make a internal attribution. They tend to say that's because they're a good person, or it's something to do with that couple. And anything that negative that they do, they'll look for excuses in the environment. Now the opposite tends to happen with unhappy couples. The partner does something bad, they say, well, because that's who they are. They do something good, it's like, okay, so they must have got a pay rise, or so he didn't buy me those flowers, he must have got them given to him and now he's just giving them to me, or something like that. Okay, so these are the 8 studies. This is how we can cover the topics and the content. Now we have to think carefully about the 3 approaches: biological, cognitive, and socio-cultural. So the biological factor here I would recommend focusing on is evolution. We want to give an evolutionary explanation for personal relationships. And really specifically, we're going to give an evolutionary explanation for the formation of personal relationships. And that's where we can use Buss's cross-cultural study. Cultural dimensions is a socio-cultural factor. Buss's study looks at that, as does Levine. So we've got 2 studies for that approach. And Raymond Holtz Monroe, maybe not cultural dimensions, but it is looking at cultural factors. Then we get into the cognitive explanations. Now, that's an unlikely question, but we just have to be prepared for it just in case. So we have these 2 studies about attributions. And it's not only for the cognitive approach that we would revise these 2. These are also useful for the explanations for why relationships change or end, as I mentioned earlier. I wouldn't use these for communication, Fincham and Graham Connolly, just for explanations for why relationships end. Man, I wish they would just call it divorce. Anyway, I suppose they need to keep it broad for lots of different examples we might use. So now just to note, as much as possible, of course I've tried to align my Student's Guide textbook with the revision textbook with the flashcards. The only issue with that is that actually the clarification that the approaches could be linked to the topics and they could be exam questions by themselves specifically happened about 12 months after the IB Psychology Guide was published and after all of us had written all the textbooks. So then that's why these don't appear in the first drafts. But these are on my blog. I'll put the link below as well, so you can access those, the attribution studies on there. Now we have to think carefully about the research methods and the ethical considerations. So I would say Gottman and Levinson, both of these are really good examples of correlational studies. So that's a really good research method to use in human relationships, for the personal relationships topic especially, right? And the reason for that is because, well, it's pretty hard to manipulate communication patterns in a laboratory setting, and you don't really want to measure the effects, the negative outcomes of different communication patterns on couples, because there's some pretty serious ethical considerations there, right? Are you going to say, all right, we think that stonewalling, might make people unhappy, so this group you're going to stonewall, this group you're not, and then it just has all sorts of problems. So what they do is they follow couples over a long period of time, and they measure them on their communication patterns, and they see how often they exhibit different behaviors and different styles of communicating, and they measure their marital satisfaction using questionnaires, and then they see how strongly those things are correlated. Same thing with the attributions. They're good examples of correlational studies. With any correlational study, the key ethical consideration I would recommend focusing on is anonymity. Now, instantly we can see how this is relevant when it comes to marital satisfaction and studies on couples who are married and their communication, right? You don't want everyone knowing, your scores on your marital satisfaction test, right? So anonymity here becomes really important. Okay, so these are the studies. Just one last review here. Okay, and so these studies can be used to cover the personal relationships option. I want to reiterate that my goal here is not to just reduce the course and just to game the exam system and try to find the shortcuts. Really, the goal in reducing the amount of studies is to give you, the students and teachers, the time to focus on the concepts. right? The studies should be supporting evidence in IB psychology. But the problem is that we've reinforced this idea that the studies are what you need to get the high marks. Actually, if you only focus on the studies, you're limited in the marks you can get because you're limited in the knowledge and understanding you can show of psychology. So when it comes to formation of personal relationships, be able to explain why and how has evolution driven us to to find these particular facial characteristics attractive, or why people across cultures might have different preferences based on their cultural values, right, related to individualism and collectivism. Communication, be able to explain how and why those patterns of communication can boost a couple's marital satisfaction, or it might decrease it. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. Why is contempt, toxic, what does Gottman call it? Toxic acid, sulfuric acid for love, I think he calls it. Why are those things? So it's about reducing the study so you can focus on the concepts. Right? I can't stress that enough. What most students do, and the reason why most students fall in that 4 and 5 range in IB psychology, is they just describe Ames method results of the studies, and there's very little conceptual understanding of the topics. So use these guidelines to focus on a limited amount of studies, but the time that you've saved revising extra studies, put that into revising the concepts and the topics and deepening your critical thinking. So being able to actually not only explain these topics, but be able to critically evaluate your own explanations. Remember, critical thinking in psychology is but. You can say evolution can explain personal relationships in the formation, but communication can influence relationships, but. All right, and then so develop that. Okay, that's my little rant there. Flashcards are available, link in the description. All these studies that I talk about, I had to go through really systematically to make sure that every possible approach that I would recommend you have the right studies for. So these are all included in the IB flashcard series, as well as being in the revision guide as well. You can buy these as bundles to save you time and money. Here's the blog. I'm trying to get out I'm trying to update some of the old posts to make them more relevant, to add to the content. I'm trying to write new posts every week. This is of course all free. All the information there is free. We've got Facebook groups. Everything is there. Right. I really hope that's helpful. Again, we're about reducing studies so we can actually focus on teaching psychology. Best of luck for your exams. If you've got a question, pop it in the comments.